I'd heard through American poets that there was a reading series at Morden Tower run by Tom Picard, a young lad who'd made friends with the immortal, mysterious Basil Bunting.
Allen Ginsberg there, describing his first visit to Newcastle in 1964, where he met Basil Bunting and read at Morden Tower. So who was the immortal, mysterious Basil Bunting, and what was his connection to Morden Tower, Tom and Connie Pickard? I'm here with Dr. Alex Niven. He's a lecturer in English literature at Newcastle University, and he's currently editing the selected letters of Basil Bunting for Oxford University Press. So I'm just going to begin by asking, who was Basil Bunting?
Great, yeah. So Basil Bunting, he was born in 1900s, died in 1985. So was around for most of the 20th century. He was born and lived for most of his life in the northeast of England. He was born in Scotswood and died in Hexham. Travelled kind of all around the world. Became a notable sort of poetic figure, firstly in the 1930s. He came into the orbit of Ezra Pound's modernist, kind of high modernist milieu in the 1920s and 1930s, and kind of rubbed shoulders with people like W.B. Yeats, Ford Madox Ford, but never really, his sort of poetic career didn't really get off the ground at that time, and he kind of gave up writing poetry in the later 30s, became a sailor, had quite an interesting Second World War, was probably a spy of some kind in the sort of 40s and early 50s, and then had a big sort of revival of his poetic career in the 60s in Newcastle, at this time of counterculture and kind of modernist revival and a kind of insurgent kind of late modernist scene. It was rediscovered by a kind of younger modernist generation and became a focal point of Morden Tower at its foundation. The Morden Tower readings obviously started by Tom and Connie Pickard, two much younger local literary figures, but partly I think with Bunting in mind as a kind of big selling point. Bunting was a kind of famous kind of cult figure who attracted lots of the kind of notable early readers at the Tower. People like Robert Creeley and Allen Ginsberg came to Morden Tower, I think, partly because of Bunting's pull. So that's Bunting. I obviously, Brig Flats, his masterpiece was written, in the context of the Morden Tower scene. It was written in 1964, 1965, really in the immediate wake of the Morden Tower readings getting off the ground. Brig Flats are kind of modernist, short, long poems, so-called, in the vein of poems like The Wasteland, Eliot's Wasteland, and Four Quartets, but with a kind of Northumbrian epic narrative at its centre. Bunting's autobiography, but also a kind of collage of Northumbrian cultural images and narratives. And Brig Flats was really the making of Bunting at this very kind of late age. He retired from his job at Newcastle Evening Chronicle. He didn't particularly like working at the Chronicle, it must be said. And for a while, he became a relatively celebrated literary figure. Since that late revival, and especially since his death, his reputation has kind of fluctuated. He still hasn't really got the credit he deserves, I think. I obviously would say that, but I think it's true. Partly because I think he's a kind of marginal, kind of regional poet. He's kind of away from the centre of what the English kind of literary establishment regards as one of their guys. and various other reasons. But yeah, Bunting, very important figure, very kind of heroic, a complicated figure, but I think, certainly from a literary perspective, a kind of heroic figure in the northern and kind of regional modernist British poetic scene and poetic history.
Okay, great. Yeah, so that's a great overview. So it may be worth going back and focusing on a few wee bits. So I'm quite interested in, so sort of after the war, he works in newspapers. He's at the Evening Chronicle, as you say. So then how does that kind of new generation start to discover him? Because obviously you got the kind of context of the British Poetry Revival, which is maybe worth explaining, the so-called British Poetry Revival, which is maybe worth explaining.
Variously defined, but it's a kind of scene that it really peaked in the kind of mid to late 60s with kind of aftershocks, I guess, going into the 70s and 80s, and even arguably in some ways the present day. J.H. Prynne still just about alive, I think. The kind of experimental Cambridge, so-called Cambridge poet, a central figure in the British Poetry Revival. I guess someone like Prynne represents the more kind of academic, highfalutin wing of the British Poetry Revival. It also encompassed sort of tangentially, pop poetry, the kind of, Liverpool scene, the so-called Mersey sounds, this quite kind of freewheeling, response to, pop music and pop art. We want to have pop poetry. It was, I think it's fair to say, always in some way in allegiance with the kind of hippie and countercultural atmosphere of the 60s and 70s. I guess in contrast to the more kind of conservative literary establishment, that's kind of a bit of a straw man portrait, but I think, if you want a kind of simple way of understanding the British Poetry Revival, it was this kind of, countercultural, kind of an insurgency of kind of young, countercultural, often quite experimental and kind of demotic and often regional voices, Liverpool, Newcastle, Glasgow. I don't know if Cambridge counts as a regional voice, but just about.
Yeah. So I suppose in terms of the sort of neo-modernist thing you talked about, there's the sort of going back into the 50s again as a kind of reaction against the movement poets.
Yes,
It's like outdated to talk about the movement in sort of totalizing terms, but obviously Larkin and Gunn and so on, and reacting against what they see as both a kind of formally and quite conservative in both form and content. And they're looking to America, so Black Mountain and beat poetry, and also the kind of network of small magazines. Transatlantic comes in there. Gail Turnbull's Migrants, a really important one, is a kind of operating out of America and England simultaneously, like Worcester, I think. And he's kind of, Michael Shear's working as a sort of talent scout, and he's kind of interested in the English region. So I think that's where people like Tom Pickard start kind of picking up on that.
Yeah, I mean, we're getting right down into the kind of real sort of nitty gritty of this quite kind of obscure tangle of poets. But yeah, Gail Turnbull, kind of Scottish neo-modernist or late modernist poet, as you say, actually got in contact with Bunting in the late 50s during this period where Bunting was working at the Evening Chronicle and quite depressed and hadn't written any poetry for, almost a decade. And then got back in touch with Bunting when the Morden Tower scene started to gather pace, and was involved in, with Michael Shea, a republication of a poem that Bunting had published in 1951 called The Spoils, which was his kind of last big, short, long poem prior to Brig Flats, with artwork by the pop artist Richard Hamilton, who was then in the fine art department at Newcastle University. So yeah, it was really a case of these kind of regional British. So yeah, you have Gail Turnbull, Scottish poet doctor who had lived in the States and Canada, I think, for
That's right. Yeah.
for many years, and then moving to Worcester, you know, and you know, Bunting in Newcastle. So you have these kind of networks across the British region, sort of extending over to the States, which, as you say, really I think underlines, yeah, that again, that this was something quite different. This British poetry revival scene from the kind of, you know, the kind of home counties pastoralism, which you still see in, you know, poets of the 50s, movement poets. You know, even Larkin living in Hull, you know, still very much a kind of, has that kind of slightly, you know, depressive, traditionalist English side to him. You know, I think for anyone who is, you know, looking for a kind of handle on this, you know, Larkin is sort of the Coldplay of the poetic world. You know, as much, you know, people who haven't really read much poetry sort of say, you know, I don't really know many 20th century poets, but I really like Philip Larkin. It's a bit like people who don't really know much about music sort of say, you know, I don't really listen to modern music, but, you know, Coldplay have a few good melodies. I always think, you know, Larkin is, if you like Philip Larkin, then think again. Basil Bunting is the one to go for.
Where does Tom and Connie Pickard come into this?
So Tom and Connie Pickard. Connie Pickard was a teacher. Tom Pickard's slightly younger than Connie. Was really in his late teens. In the kind of early to mid 60s, and they got together as a couple, and I think it was actually on a trip to Edinburgh, and you probably know the name of the name of the bookshop escapes.
Oh, the Paperback.
The Paperback, yeah, I think it was on a visit to the Paperback where they sort of thought, you know, they had this kind of, you know, transformative trip up to Edinburgh, obviously not too far from Newcastle, and thought they would do something similar in Newcastle. Morden Tower, you know, was originally, and I think for a long time after its foundation, had a kind of bookshop, the Morden Tower Book Room. You know, it kind of had radical pamphlets and poetry publications, you know, kind of on the side wall of the Morden Tower. So I think it was actually originally going to be a bookshop. You'd have to kind of check with Tom. But yeah, I think they were inspired by the Edinburgh example and wanted to do something in Newcastle. Couldn't initially find a venue, and then the council sort of said, you know, there's this sort of dilapidated tower in the old town walls. You can have that for, you know, kind of peppercorn rent, and do what you want with it. And I think it just sort of exploded from that point. Obviously, as I said, you know, Pickard's, the Pickards. Well, it was Tom actually. You know, Tom Pickard was writing poetry and got in touch with Bunting, I think on the recommendation of Jonathan Williams, another figure who we haven't mentioned, another kind of figure from these kind of obscure transatlantic networks. You know, spoke to Jonathan Williams in the States, and Jonathan Williams said, you know, well, hang on, you know, the kind of greatest English modernist poet lives 20 minutes on the train away in Wylam. Why don't you go and visit him? And Tom Pickard kind of went to visit Bunting, and Bunting sort of helped him with his poetry. And I think it was just one of those magical comings together, really, in literary history, that you get once in a while. So, you know, Bunting just suddenly kind of dropping from the sky, almost from the perspective of Tom and Connie Pickard, and obviously the kind of moment of the mid 60s. You have all sorts of kind of social and cultural contexts, you know, the kind of expansion of higher education, and, you know, obviously the kind of wider growth of a sort of counterculture, just kind of, you know, setting a light in, you know, 64, 65, 66, which is, you know, the kind of early days of Morden Tower.
Okay, great. Yeah. So yeah, maybe you could tell me about setting up Morden Tower and where Bunting comes into that.
Okay, so the first reading at Morden Tower was on the 16th of June 1964, Bloomsday. Not sure if it was coincidence or not that they scheduled the first reading for Bloomsday, the day in which Joyce's Ulysses takes place. Pete Brown was, I think, the first reader. Pete Brown, who is perhaps best known for writing some Cream lyrics, some lyrics for the band Cream, Sunshine of Your Love, most notably. But Pete Brown was a kind of notable figure in the British poetry revival, certainly at this point, a kind of notable figure in this poetry scene. And I guess, that kind of brings home the fact that this was part of this kind of wider cultural moment, which extended into music and the things that were going on in the musical world. Tom Pickard formed a band that played at Middle Earth when there was the famous sort of drugs bust. Middle Earth, the countercultural venue in London. So the first reading at Morden Tower, Pete Brown, 1964. Ginsberg arrived about a year later, I think May or June 1965, just after he kind of met up with the Beatles and Dylan in that kind of famous meeting in London. And obviously around about the time you have the big international gathering at Albert Hall, a big kind of countercultural poetic milestone in 1965. So as I say, it just really exploded in this mid-60s moment. You have Ginsberg reading there, you have Robert Creeley, another great kind of neo-modernist or late modernist American poet. And then its history sort of stretches on for the next half century. And pretty much everybody, everybody who's anybody in certainly the kind of British Isles poetry scene, but also internationally comes to read at Morden Tower, even people you wouldn't perhaps expect, people more associated with the kind of more conservative wing of British poetry. I'm pretty sure Ted Hughes read there, Geoffrey Hill, sort of remarkably, Geoffrey Hill, real kind of establishment Anglican poet. But yeah, over the years, it's mainly maintained by Connie Pickard. Tom and Connie separated in the 70s, and Connie Pickard really maintained the power the tower, against great odds and in often very difficult circumstances for the next kind of 50 years. I think, right up until I think it was the last reading, so far as I can make out, was, early 2010s.
Yeah. Okay. So what about Bunting's meetings with these poets? There's photos of them with Ginsberg and Ferlinghetti, Gregory Corso, and so on. So I don't know if you've come up. I don't know if you've found out much about those encounters.
Yeah, well, I think it's fair to say that on the one hand, there was a bit of intergenerational discrepancy. Bunting, a much older guy in his sort of mid-60s, had, as I say, possibly worked for MI6 in the Second World War. Had certainly been quite high up in the RAF in the Second World War, even though at other times his politics and certainly his poetry were quite kind of radical. Personally, he was quite a kind of bourgeois, elderly gentleman. So on the surface, there was something of a discrepancy. I think when Bunting met people like Ginsberg and people like Ferlinghetti and Gregory Corso, I think he was irritated by Gregory Corso. Nevertheless, there was, underneath all that, I think Bunting sort of rediscovered something essential to his modernist project. Obviously, back in the 20s and 30s, Bunting had been involved in a kind of literary cultural scene that was in some ways a bit like the 50s and 60s, which but it hadn't quite got off the ground. It's kind of radical time that hadn't quite worked out, certainly as you head into the 30s. And for Bunting, meeting this younger generation was a chance to kind of get the modernist project back on the rails, as it were. And it certainly spurred him on to write Brig Flats. This kind of his masterpiece, his kind of great Northumbrian epic, his kind of great modernist poem. So I think on the surface it was a slightly unlikely meeting of the generations, but I think underneath it all it was quite a kind of magical moment at which both sides learned from each other. The kind of younger generation learned a lot from Bunting, and Bunting was kind of galvanized to write his kind of greatest poem. But yeah, so this is Bunting writing to Louis Zukofsky, an American modernist poet. He's writing in July 1964, so about a month after the first reading at the Tower. And he said, he writes that Tom Pickard, in putting the readings on at the Tower, obviously Tom and Connie Pickard, they are attracting the attention of those who have funds to provide. With luck, he may make it. He started readings in his tower. The first was done by one Pete Brown, whom I had never heard of. Apparently from his lair in some sordid doss house in Liverpool, he delights the young of that tough city with a brand of pop surrealism founded on a mixture of Lewis Carroll and gross words. At least this enabled me to get the Morden Tower into the local papers on quite a scale, and about 50, half academics, half teenagers, with a sprinkling of thugs, turned up to listen. I read a month later. The academics had gone on their holidays, but a much larger number of teenagers and some of the miscellaneous provincials who seek self-approbation in that sort of thing filled the place, showing something approaching enthusiasm and queued up for my signature at 5 bob a time. The Manchester Guardian gave 6 or 7 inches of approval and congratulated Newcastle City Council, which must have been astonished, for it knew nothing about it, on having found such an inexpensive way of keeping its young thugs out of mischief.
Okay, so that was the first reading he's describing.
Yes,
yeah.
That's an account of the first reading. So this is Bunting writing to Dorothy Pound in June 1965, kind of summarising the first year of Morden Tower. Bunting writes, about a year ago, somebody rang me up on the phone and asked if I would like to read some poetry. It turned out that the voice thought it belonged to a poet of sorts, so I said, come out. He took the next train to Wylam, where Bunting was living, and turned up inside an hour. A boy of 18, long-haired and fairly ragged, with a fistful of manuscript. He said, I heard you were the greatest living poet, so I brought my poems. Are they any good? Naturally, I expected drivel, but thought it only kind to have a look. Well, there was a good deal of drivel, a good deal of useless violence, and a good deal of rather helpless filling out of lines. But not very deeply buried, there was poetry such as one's lucky to see from time to time, and such as I had never seen from a young man, let alone a boy. I told him surgery was required, took a pen, and crossed out a lot that was encumbering the stuff. He watched, then grabbed up his manuscripts and disappeared. I thought he was gone for good, offended, not a bit of it. In 2 days he was back, and he had done for the rest of his work what I had done for 2 or 3 poems. That is my chief pleasure, the discovery of a new poet, a good one, young enough to grow a great deal. Well, I thought if poetry really has the power to renew itself, I'd better write something for these younger chaps to read. And with the boy, Tom Pickard, and Gail Turnbull each urging me on, I planned a longish poem about 750 lines. It's Brig Flats. Tom Pickard has a girl and a baby, and she, an enterprising lass, has found a derelict tower on Newcastle city walls, which the town let to her for 10 bob a week. There the two of them started poetry readings, and with energy in the telephone, they got a remarkable series of readers. On my advice, they put in no chairs. The audience sits on the floor. It's quite astonishing how this abolishes the platform and audience atmosphere and produces an intimacy in which it's possible to get over much subtler effects than an audience on chairs seems able to get. Every reader has had the same astonishment, and the place has become famous with extraordinary speed. Letters turn up from San Francisco and from Tokyo asking Tom for advice.
The Pete Brown thing's interesting. The jazz and poetry connection is a big thing, and also folk music. And a lot of it also seems tied into CND as well, particularly in the Scottish context, but England as well, like Peanuts Club, which had a jazz and poetry, and Pete Brown and Michael Horowitz started. They would put on their live new departures there, I think. Aye, so is that something you have much many records of, like the kind of music and poetry together, like the folk or jazz alongside the poetry?
Well, I mean, I guess the first thing to say is that Bunting was obviously a big advocate of various sort of theories of poetry as music. You know, the idea that poetry is very close to music in its origins as an art form, and that it should be kind of brought back to the condition of music in various ways. Break Flats is called a sonata. It's sort of controversial to what extent it is, it has kind of sonata structures underlying it. But I think it is definitely true that Bunting kind of thrived and flourished and relished being in this kind of live environment of Morden Tower, where his poetry would be a kind of live text, and would be, musical in the sense that it was being read aloud. And Bunting certainly at least imagined or hoped that in that setting people would appreciate the kind of sonic aspect of the text. So I think that's quite an important context when it comes to Morden Tower. I mean, in terms of specific musical connections, obviously, as you said, there's Pete Brown. As I said, Tom Pickard, became a musician. I think, it's one of those periods in which people kind of, write some poetry and then the next day kind of start a band, and there's quite a fluid relationship between the art forms in the mid-60s, and indeed with, visual art, and particularly with, the kind of experimental art scene in London that Paul McCartney was quite involved with, kind of circle around Better Books.
And so on, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Indica and and Barry Miles and people like that. So I think it was a period of crossover between poetry and music. And certainly, there's a video I think you can get online of a documentary made at Morden Tower in the late 60s where you get a sense of the atmosphere of the place. There's someone kind of bashing away on an acoustic guitar, playing some kind of blues song. So I think it was a very exciting time in which there's a lot of crossover between different art forms.
And I might be misremembering it, but some of the young ones not refer to him as the Wing Commander or something like that. Am I totally...
Well, yeah, Wing Commander was his final rank in the RAF, which is quite high up.
Yeah.
And I think, back in the 50s and 60s, in civic and civil life, people would often still be referred to by their military title. You would get people called Major so-and-so. I think even when I was growing up in my village in the northeast, there was the Major.
Yeah.
So I think Bunting was, literally the Wing Commander, which is, I think, equivalent to Major in the RAF. It's the equivalent rank. So, yeah, I mean, it was a kind of literal description of what he'd been in Second World War, but also as I guess, kind of it underlines the fact that he was, he wasn't, for all that he sort of embraced the 60s culture in lots of ways, he didn't, actually, I think he did take the occasional toke on occasional joints, and he let his hair grow long to an extent. So yeah, so I kind of take that back. But yeah, it was certainly an unlikely meeting of the generations at first.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting contrast with, say, Hugh McDermott, the Scottish poet who also read it, Morden Tower. He was much more resistant to the newer generation of poets in Scotland, maybe partly because of status and ego reasons, and also their conception of modernism was much more democratic than his. There's something quite Stalinist about his kind of top-down, great man view of history and poetry, the kind of idea of an intellectual vanguard. rather than something that's coming from the ground up. So, which is, I suppose, maybe the main contrast between the sort of modernist and neo-modernist thing.
Yeah, I mean, personally, I guess McDermott, as you say, had this big kind of weight of politics, which Bunting just didn't have. Bunting was, his politics are complicated, but I think it's probably best to see him as a kind of Fabian, soft left, kind of left of centre guy who at sometimes, particularly during the war, became a little bit right wing, frankly, when he was in the RAF. At other times, when he was a bit younger, was, kind of quite militantly in favour of the mining unions, and actually kind of returned to that position in the 80s in his last years during the miners' strike. But for most of the time, I think, he grew up in a Fabian environment. His dad was a Fabian. Dad was a kind of GP in Newcastle. I think his dad originally from Derbyshire, but had gone to university in Edinburgh and had kind of Fabian connections. And when Bunting went to London in the early 20s, would I think go to the Fabian. He went to LSE, founded by the Webbs, and would go to the kind of Fabian club or Fabian common room to have tea and toast. So I think the contrast with McDermott is that, Bunting was a little bit of a kind of floating voter. So I guess wasn't as kind of dogmatic in terms of this younger generation. I've actually just brought up an account from one of Bunting's letters of McDermott coming to the Morden Tower. Do you want? I could read that out.
Yeah, that'd be great. Yeah.
So this is February 1965. So again, right at the start, one of the first readings at the Tower. Bunting writes to a friend called Dennis Gocher, a London poet. He says, "Hugh McDermott stayed with me. I was warned that he ate nothing but whiskey, and he justified the warning. As near as I can calculate, he drank 3.5 bottles during his 36 hours on Tyneside, which he ballasted with 2 boiled eggs, a small spoonful of curry, and a piece of toast.
Wow.
Leaving for Manchester, he complained of stomach qualms, which he attributed to the curry. Rich Oriental food I'm not used to. Gail Turnbull and I put him to bed at 3:30 a.m. the first night. The second he was capable and coherent at midnight, but I liked the old guy very well. I was somewhat disconcerted when he kissed all the girls in the Tower and all the waitresses and barmaids he encountered, making some very startling improper proposals meanwhile in a loud, clear voice."
Crikey. I was struck by you mentioning Bunting and towards the end of his life being interested in the miners' strike and that industrial causes. Is that something? It's just like I recently rewatched Our Friends in the North, and the final episode, the Christopher Eccleston character has a copy of Tom Pickard's book on the Jarrow March. It's kind of shown up on the screen. I was like, whoa. I looked up on eBay and it was going for silly money now. But so is that something he was? Obviously, the Jarrow March is huge, and it's a kind of motif throughout the whole of Our Friends of the North, kind of standing for the kind of decline of the industrial North in a way, or the disillusionment of the labour movement. So maybe I'm kind of going off on one here, but is that something that Bunting was engaged with to the same extent as Pickard? Or?
I mean, yes and no. Tom Pickard was and is, I think it's fair to say, a more radical character in every sense. Tom's a good friend of mine, and I think his politics are some distance, were and are some distance to the left of Bunting's, and I think there's certainly a letter where Bunting's responding to Tom Pickard's drafts, or at least ideas for the Jarrow March book, and is a little bit skeptical about its about this as a kind of a radical narrative to be celebrated. As I said, Bunting was often a kind of bit of a centrist dad in some contexts. But on the other hand, yeah, Bunting was, if you want to get quite kind of, subtle and academic about it, Bunting was an empiricist.
Mm.
He was very anti-German idealism.
Mm.
Kind of in his kind of academic training, kind of started off by really sort of rejecting German idealism and kind of thinking this was all, if things couldn't be anchored in kind of practical examples and kind of plain English speech, then it wasn't meaningful.
Mm.
So Bunting was quite kind of he was quite opposed to sort of abstract political and philosophical ideas, which led to a kind of conservatism in some contexts. On the other hand, I think that also led him to, he was very very interested and very much more positive about the kind of practical examples of labor and of working class life, as expressed in, for example, the unions. So he as I said, he's very kind of in favor, I think, kind of waded into the general strike in 1926 and in some kind of dashing way that hasn't been, he kind of claimed he kind of waded into the strike in a way that hasn't been substantiated in 1926. And there were letters to Ezra Pound in the 30s where he's saying, all of this politics stuff is, you need to kind of stop talking about it. But if you want to see real politics, it's, the kind of mining unions of the 20s. And so similarly, for all that, as I say, sometimes he was a bit of a centrist dad. His politics kind of veered, somewhere around the centre left, sometimes getting a bit conservative at times. There were, accounts of him sort of really, late in life he lived in the Tyne Valley, which, then as now as a conservative seat, and he would, talk about Thatcher being worse than Hitler and, say kind of, up the NUM. So his politics were complex, but he was certainly always in favour of, the unions and the mining unions in particular. I think it's fair to say.
Do you fancy giving us a bit of Brig Flats or what? Or
yeah, I could read the first bit, couldn't I? Brag, sweet, tenor, bull, descant on Rothy's madrigal. Each pebble its part for the fell's late spring. Dance tiptoe, bull, black against May, ridiculous and lovely, chase, hurdling shadows, morning into noon. May on the bull's hide and through the dale, furrows fill with May, paving the slow worm's way.